Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today we will be hearing the presentation, Planning for Wildfire Resiliency, and this is a rescheduled webcast from November. We had some catastrophic technology failure, but crossing our fingers, I think we've figured out what went wrong and they've been able to fix the problems. So we're excited to be back, and thank you so much to our presenters for being willing to come back and speak to us again, and for all of you for signing back up and joining us again. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again, located in your webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And we'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all of our participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Hazard Planning Mitigation Division of APA, so thanks to them for sponsoring us today. And we have upcoming webcasts already for 2019. Save the dates. We have these dates all reserved right now. We're getting all the information up, ready for you to register. Just head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and that's where you can be able to register for these upcoming sessions. Just give us a few more days as we're compiling the info. And to log your CM credits for attending today's session, which is worth 1.5 CM credits, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account, and then up at the top, you can search for CM activities under your CM log, and you can either enter today's event number or the title of today's webcast, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions and the sessions that we're applying for, or anything that needs to be rescheduled. That's the place to find it. So be sure to join us there. And we are recording today's webcast. You can view a recording of it by just heading over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast. Not only will you be able to view today's session, but over 200 of our other sessions are available for you. We'll also have a PDF of the session available at the conclusion of the session on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, that's it for me. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Christine, the other Christine, who's going to get us started today. Christine, the controls are over to you. And don't forget to unmute yourself. Perfect.
That was the part that I was struggling with. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Cajano, and I am a technical manager in planning at Michael Baker International. But I'm here today as a founding member of the Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning Division of APA and a member of the division's Professional Development Committee. So we'd like to thank APA Ohio for coordinating the webcast, getting us all here for round 2, and for welcoming our division to the webcast series with open arms. A little bit about us. Our division is pretty new, but we've been growing rapidly and have about doubled our numbers in the past year. We are really proud that of our nearly 1,500 members, we're representing 21 countries, from as close as Canada to as far away as Thailand, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Iran, and Turkey. And because we're a relatively new division and our subject matter, frankly, may be unfamiliar to some of you, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to frame what we mean when we say hazard mitigation and disaster recovery. The disaster recovery part is a little bit more obvious, But hazard mitigation is a little bit different than some other contexts of mitigation, perhaps for greenhouse gases. So for us, mitigation is the collection of activities that reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural hazards. So we're really talking about keeping people out of harm's way. We're not talking about activities like sandbags or putting plywood over windows when you know the hurricane is coming. The things that we do are things like stronger building standards, zoning codes that keep people out of dangerous areas, and permanently removing structures, businesses, et cetera, from hazard-prone areas. Disaster recovery is the work that communities do to build back after a disaster event. And you may be thinking, like, what is the role of a planner when you're really talking about emergency management activities? But frankly, we have a big role here. After all, some of the best and most long-term ways to reduce natural hazard risk lie in where and how communities build and develop. Planners have a unique role as generally the people in communities who think about space and place and about how all those pieces fit together. Now, I typically work in flood hazard mitigation, but we've got two really wonderful speakers today who are going to speak to wildfire planning. Our first speaker is Molly Mowry. Molly is an AICP and the owner of Wildfire Planning International. She's a certified land use planner specializing in helping communities increase their resilience to wildfire. She has over 15 years of experience working with communities on the challenges of sustainability, environmental planning, and the wildland-urban interface. In her consulting practice, Molly manages a national wildfire planning assistance program, the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, and is a director of the nonprofit Community Wildfire Planning Center. She serves on multiple committees, including the Sustainable Development Code Advisory Council. Molly recently did me a huge favor and developed the first National Land Use Planning for Wildfire workshop for FEMA Region 8. Molly holds a master's degree in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Our second presenter today is Will Smith. Will is the senior planner for Wasco County, where he oversees current planning. He received his master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning from Tufts University. He also recently passed his AICP exam, so he is an AICP on the fly at the moment. Will spent almost a decade as a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service in Wyoming and Oregon prior to joining the team at Wasco County. He's currently leading the county's Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan update process and will be doing the same for the community's Wildfire Protection Plan early next year. Molly and Will are actually working together on wildfire planning, which makes them such a great pair for this webinar today. Molly's going to cover some of the bigger picture issues related to wildfire resilience, and Will share his particular community's experience planning for wildfires. And we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A this afternoon. And now we're going to have a poll as we transition between me and Molly, which you'll see in the GoToMeeting toolbar on your screen. Please respond and help us get a better idea of who we've got with us today.
Great, thank you. Okay, so our first question, we just want to know where y'all are from. So I have that poll, I just released it, so go ahead and tell us. And I just did it by time zone. We'll give it a few more moments here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and then I'll share the results. So it looks like 46% of our attendees are in the Eastern time zone, 21% Central, 17% Mountain, 14% Pacific, and 1% outside of the US. Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our next question. Have you been personally impacted by a wildland fire? So if you could just respond for me, yes or no. We'll give it a few seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then I'll share the results with everyone. 82% nope, and 18% yes. I have been personally impacted by a wildland fire. Okay, and then do you want me to go, Christine, do you want me to do the third question too? I'll just take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay.
This is Molly. Yes, we do.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, so the last question right now. Here we go. How familiar are you with the Wildland-urban interface, the WUI? So if you could go ahead and take a look at those responses and pick one that relates closely to you, we'll give it a few seconds, and then we'll show the results. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results. So 19% very familiar, 38% kind of, 13% barely, and my favorite, 29% WUI what? So there we go. The majority of our folks are kind of, and right under that is I don't know what that is. So I'm going to go ahead and hide these results, and I'm going to turn the screen over to Molly, our next presenter. Thanks for responding, everybody. All right, Molly, you just have to click to show your screen. Perfect. We see you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm really happy we could reschedule this timely webinar topic. I do have to preface this with that I'm getting over a cold, and I have the dreaded coughing phase of the cold. So I will do my best not to have to put myself on mute, but worst case scenario, I may have to step away for just a couple seconds and do a little coughing. So the content I'm going to present today focuses on how planners can play a role in reducing wildfire damage to communities. And much of this presentation content is based on a forthcoming APA PAS report. It's called Planning the Wildland-urban Interface. So I'm really excited to preview a lot of that content with you today, and also just want to credit my co-authors, Anna Reed, Kelly Johnston, and Tarek Wafai. So I'll tell a little bit more about the PAS report at the end, just in case you're interested. But the poll results were very helpful for us to kick this webinar off, just to look at where or what the Wildland-urban interface is, which we fondly refer to as the WUI. So what do we really mean by the WUI? Sometimes you'll hear the WUI defined as a predetermined area or zone. And often there's also a misconception that it has to be somewhere in or near a forest. So I wanted to offer a broader conceptual definition today for thinking about the WUI. And that is that the WUI is any area where the combination of human development and vegetation has the potential to result in negative impacts from wildfire on the community. There are many WUIs across the country. This is not just a Western phenomenon. I saw that many of you are from the Eastern time zone, so I'm excited because I included some examples in today's webinar from Eastern communities. And these pictures here span coast to coast. We have California to New Jersey, and in between Colorado, Tennessee, Washington, and Oregon. And you can see that these WUIs really vary based on native vegetation, topography, development patterns. You might actually be able to pick out two different development patterns here. And these are called the intermix and the interface. The WUI intermix, which is a picture here on the left, is where development is interspersed or scattered throughout vegetation. And so there's really no clear line of demarcation between where the wildland fuels, what we call them, where they start and stop. And an intermix is much more prevalent in rural or exurban or even large lot suburban development areas. The interface is where development is grouped and directly adjacent to areas with wildland fuels. So there's a clear line, as you can see, between the development and the vegetation. And this is often that abrupt edge between some highly urbanized or suburban neighborhood and a wildland area. These are much more common in new development areas, such as green fields, or where you may have an urban growth boundary in place. So analyzing the spatial patterns of the WUI helps us as planners really understand the different ways in which wildfire can threaten a community. So for example, this continuum of wildland to urban densities, which we made similar to the urban transect concept, shows how a wildland fire might directly threaten an intermix community, so more on the left side of the continuum. But there are areas deep within developed areas which are still subject to embers, for example. So these spatial patterns can also help us think about different mitigation strategies. So for example, vegetation management requirements might be easier to implement on larger lots, but these same areas are often more costly in terms of fire suppression because homes that are scattered across a broader geographic area require different kinds of resources. And on the other hand, the compact urban areas are more prone to urban conflagrations. So this is where you see fire spreading from the neighboring wildlands to one structure, and then it can quickly affect multiple structures, and that's where we see a lot of the large losses from wildfires, large structure losses. So communities will often spatially assess their WUI to help identify what these types of patterns are. This is an example from Chelan County, Washington, where we worked with them and the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which is a branch of the U.S. Forest Service, to analyze the housing units in terms of their WUI Intermix and Interface. And notice that the WUI only exists in these developed areas. So in other words, the wildland or the undeveloped vegetated areas, it's not a WUI until it becomes developed. So it essentially takes those structures to make it a WUI. So many of these assessments are based on simply the distribution of housing units and wildland vegetation within an area, but some communities define their WUI more broadly. So for example, you could have an entire portion of the county that might be labeled as the WUI, which is west of a major highway, or is an entire area except for a downtown or airport facilities, for example. So this idea of the WUI can not only just capture housing, but it can also capture other critical infrastructure and facilities, businesses, parks and natural areas, and cultural resources, and many more. The WUI spatial assessments are different from wildfire hazard or risk assessments. The wildfire hazard or risk maps identify the local conditions related to vegetation and other factors and can display the potential severity of a wildfire's impact. Again, this is another example from Chelan County. So think of the WUI as where the values are in a community, the values that we just talked about, like housing, critical infrastructure, etc. And then think of wildfire assessments as informing planners about what is the relative worst case wildfire exposure that you can expect in any of these given polygons, where development may or may not exist. So a national team of scientists and researchers from the Forest Service and the University of Wisconsin-Madison quantified the entire country's WUI. And again, this was just based on housing unit density and wildland vegetation. So this is what our national WUI looks like from the 50,000-foot view. Remember too, this is not a wildfire hazard map. Often when we show this map, many of the communities that look at this from the west kind of go, wait, I thought I was in the WUI. And, if you were to zoom in, you would see many more small pockets of WUI identified throughout the western lands. But it really reflects where a lot of the population density is on the eastern seaboard or along the eastern seaboard. So what's interesting about being able to quantify the WUI at this national level, it also gives us data and trends. So some of the recent analysis from this group showed that the WUI is now the fastest growing land use type in the conterminous U.S. So between 1990 and 2010, the WUI grew from roughly 30 million to 44 million housing units. So this is interesting because whereas many of us aren't even familiar with the WUI, in fact, what really stood out to me in reading this research is that it's the largest or the fastest growing land use type. Another point that's interesting is although we didn't see a lot of the WUI necessarily in the West, some of the highest growth rates of the WUI are occurring in the Western United States. So you can see here that some areas are experiencing percentage-wise greater than 75% growth in WUI areas. So where we have WUIs, we have WUI fires. And a WUI fire is a wildfire that involves this combined fuel complex, which is natural vegetation and structures or infrastructure. So it's essentially a wildfire that enters this developed area. You could see this really clearly from the example of the Lake Christine fire, which was outside of Basalt, Colorado this summer. It started from illegal activities on a local shooting range. And I took it because I thought it was, maybe you can see my mouse here, it was really interesting to see this wild land adjacent to the developed area. And in fact, some of this was where some of the structures were lost. It's a really good example of, unfortunate but good example visually of WUI fire. So the other point here is that the majority of wildfires are human caused. Not all, but most. And the more people we have in the WUI, the more fires we are seeing. And this is one of the reasons why wildfire seasons are getting longer. Another reason, which I'm sure you might have heard about recently with a lot of the news, is another reason why wildfire seasons are getting longer is related to climate change. So climate change is affecting the intensity, the frequency, and pattern of wildfires. And we can expect increased temperatures, less frequent or predictable precipitation, and this is already leading to hotter and drier conditions. So today's WUI fires are really a result of both climate change and previous land use decisions. And these land use decisions have to do with where we put development and forest-related land use management. So we can't isolate it to one factor. It's much more nuanced than saying, climate change is the reason why all these fires are so bad. Or we can't also only say that past forest management. So think of it as this combination. And what is, I think, worth noting, though, is that under this warmer and drier future climate, fire management agencies will continue to be further challenged by fire weather conditions. And this really is starting to push a lot of our current capacity to put out fires quickly beyond what first responders are capable of doing. And that will result and continue to result in a substantial increase in these fires with many devastating consequences. So in other words, there's limits to the firefighters' ability to control wildfires. And this makes the need for addressing the WUI through other strategies, including land use planning and other mitigation activities, it makes the need greater than ever. So what can planners really do? I wanted to walk through a series of best practices and things we see in the field. I've been working on this for almost 15 years and really, look at a set of strategies that work and that hopefully will generate some ideas on your end of what you can do and how you can start thinking about development decisions differently when it comes to thinking about planning for the WUI. So the first one is really big picture. We often hear about people saying, well, why don't we just keep people out of these WUI areas? So if you tell people not to move there, we won't have a WUI. And there are ways to do this, and urban growth boundaries and other growth mechanisms can be effective for WUI growth and many other reasons, not just wildfire. These are examples from Boulder County, the community of Boulder, Colorado on the left with a very clear urban growth boundary, And then Bend, Oregon's recent urban growth boundary update that occurred as part of their comprehensive plan update, they looked also at where they'll further analyze future density related to wildfire hazard. However, many areas are subject to the impacts of wildfire. So 94% of our lands in the U.S. are considered wildfire prone. And it's really unrealistic to assume that we can just limit the amount of growth that will occur in the WUI, because frankly, with so much of our land being wildfire prone, there's not an obvious answer to saying we simply won't build in these areas. We really don't have that luxury of avoiding all wildfire prone areas. So while we can, kind of control the amount of growth that may occur, especially intermix WUIs that we talked about in this kind of ex-urban rural pattern, it's very unlikely we're going to find limiting WUIs in general as the primary solution. So we have to start looking at what sort of requirements should be in place to safely allow development to occur. So for example, I was on a tour a few years ago in this community, and I'm not going to pick out or point out who they were, because all communities have some challenges. But this was a good example of where this community showed me the location of a future subdivision. You can kind of see with my mouse here, the subdivision is going to go in back here. This is a large beetle kill area, so it means that these gray trees are all dead from a beetle infestation that occurred over the past several decades. And the planners there said that there would be some additional requirements for structures, but this was a one-way in, one-way out road. And so it's nice, it's good to have additional requirements for these structures so that the structures themselves are safe, but it really doesn't change the public safety or the first responder safety for this one-way in, one-way out road. In other words, it doesn't support evacuation for keeping the public safe. And this is a large issue everywhere. Unfortunately, it's all too common in places that I travel to across the country. This is actually an example from a community in Tennessee that burned during the November 2016 fires. There were more than a dozen lives lost during that evacuation. And we recently saw a similar outcome in Paradise, California, on a much larger scale. When I first looked at this aerial, I assumed that many of these roads went out somewhere. And when I talked to the fire department there, they said, no, actually, these all lead back to many dead ends or, cul-de-sacs where you can't get out. And in this case, there were a lot of tourists and other people that are already unfamiliar with the area. And then you have these high density units. So you're really setting yourself up for a disaster when a place may be wildfire prone, and you're limiting the ability for the public to safely evacuate. And we see this across the country. So we need to look very carefully at when is it necessary to require multiple access routes when you have a certain density of structures or an expected number of occupants. Sometimes one route, it can be just an emergency access route. It doesn't have to be an improved road. So it may be under certain conditions only that you allow people to go somewhere. You can also require vegetation management along roadways during the time of development. So this would be a good example where you'd want to require that vegetation management before a subdivision gets developed. And this is often done through subdivision regulations, or you could do it even with through the fire code. So another important aspect of good access is good road signage. So I'll let you guess which example here would be easier to read during smoky conditions. And I think it hopefully is obvious. So we also recommend that communities have requirements for standardized, non-combustible signs. This is good, again, for both the public and first responder safety. And this can also be part of subdivision regulations or the fire code where it focuses on access. Another key issue is with water supply. So ideally, we want communities to develop in areas where fire hydrants are required and maintained, but we recognize that many rural communities don't have this luxury. So this is a common challenge that we see across the West. The areas with limited or no water, community may have a volunteer fire department, and when we talk to communities in places like this, the closest brush truck that would be responding to a fire would have to be hauling in water from an hour or more away. You can imagine this is not an ideal scenario. So again, where fire hydrants cannot be an option, an alternative option is to require on-site water storage. This is also a really good opportunity to work with your fire department. So model codes and standards can dictate what is appropriate here. Excuse me. Might have to take just a sip of water. One moment. So again, this is an opportunity where planners don't have to know the technical specifications. They just have to know what's appropriate for an area with wildfire hazard. Christine, I might be losing my voice, so I'll see how much longer I can keep going.
No problem. Like we talked about early on, Will can always do some kind of song and dance for us to make up some time. That's not an issue. So just go as long as you can, and then we can flip over to Will.
Sounds great. Okay. Another opportunity I wanted to point out is subdivision layout and site planning. So this is a really good example. Excuse me. This is a really good fire example of where a wildfire moved through unmanaged vegetation. It came down here from a mountain side and it moved through this community. And you can see where the fire affected homes that were directly adjacent with no setback along the wildland area here. However, homes that did have a setback, there may be a variety of risk factors here, but homes that did not have a setback were not affected in the same way. So we advocate for where development occurs in proximity to slopes, that there's a setback from that slope. Another topic that frequently comes up is with power lines. So power lines can be a source of ignition, and we've seen this frequently, especially in high wind events. They can also be an area that influences fire activity in different ways, depending on how the vegetation near the power lines are managed. So I took this example from the Highway 31 fire, which occurred in South Carolina in 2009. And I thought this was really interesting when I first heard about it, because I heard the South Carolina Forestry Department talking about how the fire behavior changed. It started here in this natural area, and once it actually moved through here and under the power lines where all the vegetation had cleared, the fire behavior changed significantly, and the first responders were able to control the fire and manage it as soon as it entered this unvegetated area. So this was kind of a unique example where you did have the proximity of a cleared vegetation positively influencing the outcome. Now, there were still a lot of homes lost from what we talked about earlier, embers. This is a really big source of ignition for many communities. So you can see here, you may look at this initially and think, this isn't really the WUI. There's not a lot of trees or, vegetation in this community. But I chose this example here, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. of what happens when these embers land near a home. So the structure itself, which is often regulated through the building, fire, or WUI code, looks at the roof, siding, walls, vents, gutters, and even attachments. And the goal of these regulations is to help the structure withstand fire without suppression resources. So again, working with the fire marshal or a building official can help you determine what's appropriate. You don't have to become a building code expert, but I would argue that you can't really have a wildfire resilient community unless you address the structure. And that does include attachments. So common vulnerabilities that I want to point out are decks and fences. And some jurisdictions will require mitigation of the entire property when an applicant puts in a new deck on their home. Other jurisdictions also require a non-combustible break between the fence and the home so that when the fire starts on the edge of a property, it doesn't get carried to the main structure. These may seem very minor, but it's often all of these minor vulnerabilities that collectively add up for structures. And going back to our example of landscaping, many of these small bushes near the home look very innocent, right? They don't look like they could have a large impact on a structure. But we have to think about what happens under scenarios where you have this large ember storm. And if you have seen any videos of some of these horrifying experiences that people have been going through in recent years in wildfires that are posted on YouTube or on the news, you'll see an ember shower and you'll see all of these embers landing somewhere. And unfortunately, we want to make sure that these places that are right next to a structure are clear of debris, of mulch, of shrubs, anything that can quickly ignite and bring a heat source to the main structure. So some communities now require clearance of 5 feet of non-combustible area around a home, as well as the use of fire-resistant plants. This is an example from Wenatchee, Washington, where they did recently update their wildfire regulations following a wildfire that burned homes. And these fire-resistant plant lists are often available through state forestry departments or cooperative extension services or even your local fire department. So you don't have to come up with this on your own. You just have to be aware that it's a resource for you. And we often, well, not often, but we tend to sometimes overlook appropriate mitigation and, the location of other land uses that can pose as hazards. So, for example, lumber yards or storage warehouses can sometimes be problematic during a wildfire if they're not mitigated because they're storing combustible materials. Other uses, such as shooting ranges, which I mentioned earlier, can result in unwanted fires. So think about what type of conditions should be required to mitigate these type of uses if they are proposed in a high wildfire hazard area in your community. This might be vegetation management, or requiring a certain distance from other structures, or even putting an ordinance in place for regulating the storage of combustible materials. So finally, consider temporary uses. And these are places in your community where people are going to gather, typically on a hot day. They might be camping or using fireworks. And you have to think about what kind of fire protection requirements are necessary to approve this kind of permit. Often planners will work with their local fire department to ensure they have the capacity for this kind of event so that if you are putting a lot of people in a position where they may be exposed to a wildfire, they can safely evacuate. There are enough response resources on hand. So in summary, there are many things that planners can do to affect change in the WUI. And these are just, I would say, not even the full list, but I wanted to, go through some examples to pique your interest in this. And I'm just going to highlight 2 of the planning tools two of the planning tools that we often use or recommend using for planners when they're thinking about WUI planning. And Will was going to go into a little bit more depth in his presentation on these plans and codes as well. So the first is a comprehensive plan. These are some tips on thinking about the comprehensive plan or your master plan or general plan and ways to really strategize incorporating wildfire into it. So, you want to make sure you have background information for context for the reader. And you can integrate wildfire across different planning or topics. You don't have to restrict it to just one small area of the comprehensive plan, but all of the topics that we just went over span many different ideas about the WUI. That would be critical infrastructure, transportation, even think about trails and recreation and open space. So you want to look for these synergies and really see where you can, directly or indirectly support wildfire planning in your comprehensive plan. We also recommend avoiding policy conflicts, so you're not, inadvertently trying to plan for wildfire, but also promoting something else. A good example is when we see communities promoting a design aesthetic that might be more pioneer related or Western themed, and it's using a lot of combustible wooden materials and features or architectural standards that rely on wooden features. And then a quick note about, of course, aligning this with your state requirements, which may have very specific requirements for hazard planning. Also with WUI regulations, a couple tips here. Using model codes and standards are amazing resources. And there's several available through the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association. Again, your fire departments will be very familiar with these. So you don't have to know it on your own. You can simply make a good relationship with your fire department and ask them for advice. I'm going to leave it at there so I can move on, but I promise you that all of this information and many more details are going to be available in the PAS report that I mentioned at the beginning of this. So that will be coming out in April 2019. The good news is that this is a free PAS report. You don't have to be a member like the other PAS reports because this was sponsored by the Forest Service. So look for that PAS report. We'll also be presenting on it at the APA National Conference. And you can always contact me if you don't find it or see it or want to learn more. And then another resource just to highlight, it's a good segue to hand it over to Will, is that I've also been involved for several years in as the lead planner on this Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program. It's a national program that my company co-founded with Headwaters Economics. And we're able to, through grants, provide assistance to communities across the country on wildfire planning. And so we have worked with over 26 communities to date, and through this process, we've developed a really good set of best practices, and we highlight all of these communities on our website, planningforwildfire.org. And one of the communities we worked with has been Wasco County. So I'm really excited that Will's going to share what his process has been, both working with the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program and really what they were spearheading before we got the opportunity to work with them. So Will, I think we're going to do a couple more polls and then we'll transition to you.
Yep. Okay, great. Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and open up our next poll. Thank you, Molly. All right, I'm launching it now. The question is, have you been involved in developing a hazard mitigation plan or a community wildfire protection plan? So go ahead and select a response that closely relates to you, and we'll give it a few moments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it down. and we'll share the results. Okay, so it looks like 33% I have been involved, 58% I haven't been involved. Those are the two big ones. I've been involved in both, 6%. And looks good. I'm going to go ahead and hide this one and open up the next one. Go ahead and give you a few seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'll give it one more second. They're still coming in. It's, does your jurisdiction have WUI fire safety standards currently? Yes, no, don't know. Or I don't live in a fire-prone place. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it now, and then I'll share those results. 18% yes, 44% no, and 39% NA, not available. I don't live in a fire-prone place. Okay, one last question. Do you feel more prepared to plan for the WUI? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. Yes, maybe, no. Give it a few more seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and show the results. 24% yes. I want to take action now. 71% maybe, but I'm still learning, and 6% no, I still feel unprepared. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hide those, and now I'm going to change it over to Will, who will take it from there. Perfect.
All right, thanks, Christine. This is Will out here in Wasco County. Before I dig into some of the planning side of things, I want to touch on fire behavior. So we see fire behavior kind of represented by this fire behavior triangle, which includes fuels, weather, and topography. You can see on left side of your screen here an image of how slope affects fire behavior. So topography is a very important feature in directing where fire will go and how intense it'll be. You know, heat rises, and so as fire burns upslope, and at the hot part of the day, usually there's upslope, up valley winds as well to contribute, and so it'll preheat that fuel above the fire, and it'll cause it to run very quickly uphill. And here, you know, chutes or canyons, narrow areas, you know, that's consideration where you want to keep, as planners, we have the ability to approve a site plan where you can separate yourself back from that slope, as you could see in Molly's presentation. Additionally, fuels is an important feature. In this sense, you've got fuel, you know, grass burns differently than shrubs versus timber, the continuity if it's broken up. And then houses are constructed out of wood and plastic, so it's essentially a pile of gasoline and wood there, so they're fuel type as well. You can see in this image here, one house survived, the rest of them very close to each other. They're one combusted, it burned right into the next one. That continuity of fuels, much like fire will run across a meadow, it will burn through houses very quickly. And so, you know, some spacing considerations is important to think about, as well as just defensible space and managing the actual fuels around your house, like I was spoken of earlier, as far as fire-resistant fuels, the term defensible space I'll get into a little bit later, clearing a kind of fire-safe area around your house. As planners, we have a little bit less control over the weather. So things such as wind, of course, drought, temperature, or not drought exactly, but temperature and weather conditions on the ground will affect what fire does and how intense it is. And so kind of understanding how fire works can help us as planners understand how better to prepare our community to build in the right direction. So I'm out here in Wasco County, Oregon. Some of you may have heard of it. I realize we have a lot of from the east and central, but this year was the Netflix special Wild Wild Country. Wasco County got a little bit of face time there. The Rajneesh lived down in the southeast corner here. And Wasco County is right on this kind of divide. So the Cascade Mountains run kind of north-south here in this part of the state. And we are a little bit on the rain shadow. We had a particularly interesting fire season this year. Here you can see, we have the Mountain Hood National Forest on this side and reservation down here. Before I get into our fire, I'll just give you a layout of the land. This area is kind of mountainous. Mountain Hood itself sits kind of in the next county over, Hood River County. And then we have sort of forested areas, but the eastern part of our county, we have a lot of, this kind of our breadbasket up here, a lot of wheat, agriculture. Getting down here into more sage, juniper kind of landscape, much less rainfall in this whole section out here. The Dalles itself gets about 300 days of sun a year, and so we're not your typical vision of a rainy, gray Oregon. We are on the sunny side, and so because of that, and a lot of forest and grassland, and we're very combustible, and our WUI standards cover the whole county. So we don't have a specific WUI risk area currently that we just have standards on. Our fire safety standards cover the whole county. So our fire season got kicked off this year in June. We had a 100,000 acre fire burned down in South County, threatened the city of Maupin, ran right along the Deschutes River. Luckily, this area is sparsely populated, so 100,000 acres, no structures, and so that was a successful fire. There are positive effects of fire. It's not all bad. In this case, next year, the grazing down here is going to be spectacular. It took out some decadent sagebrush. It killed the junipers, which really sucked out a lot of water generally. And grass grows back thicker and greener the next year after a fire. And so it really kind of helps rejuvenate a landscape a lot of the time. And so there are, positive effects of fire. And then, of course, there are negative ones. The next big fire here in July, this unfortunately was arson. This day, it started in the afternoon. We have our gorge west winds blowing about 30 miles per hour sustained. And you can see the shape. It started out here and kind of pushed out across the county, ran about 15 miles in 5 hours, jumped the Deschutes River into the neighboring county. This was about 80,000 acres. And this burned up 80 square miles of wheat, about 1 to 2 million bushels worth. So significant economic impact on our region. As well as the fact that 52 structures burned, 4 of which were homes, and we lost one rancher who was putting a fire break in. So a very devastating fire for us. A few weeks later, we had the Long Hollow fire, similar fire pattern, about 30 to 40,000 acres, no structures burned. And then a few weeks later, we had South Valley. So it kind of burned a lot of our eastern and southern portions here. South Valley burned about 25,000 acres and had 15 structures, 3 dwellings lost. And human starts here. So again, that's significance of the human impact on our wildfire. So as you can see, Wasco County, we have a lot of fires. We have a lot of variety of fire, and we're very concerned about that. We're kind of at a crux right now in our planning world. We wrote our comprehensive plan back in 1983. These black boxes represent some of our plans. Wasco 2040 is what we're calling our comprehensive plan update. It's been in process for a few years. We finished in another year or two, looking out to 2040. And we're also updating our natural hazard mitigation plan, wrapping that up this month. That natural hazard mitigation plans, I'll get into that a little bit more detail here in a minute, but they are on a 5-year cycle, so they update a lot more frequently. And our community wildfire protection plan was written in 2005 and has not been touched since. And so we're looking at starting an update process on that next year. Notice in the polls, several of you have worked on NHMPs, but the CWPP seems to be much less popular. In our case, having all three of these connected to each other is very important. That kind of interactivity helps strengthen all of them. First, having the right inputs. The blue is where we're getting a lot of our information from, citizen input in all processes, partner agencies that reaching out to all of our partners and making sure that their needs are met. And then in this year, we had, like Molly said, we were selected as one of the community planning assistants for wildfire CPAW teams, or communities. So the CPAW team came out to visit us several times this year, and they recently provided us with a packet of final recommendations and a hazard assessment, a lot of good data going forward, a lot of good tips for implementation, how ideas to implement community wildfire protection plan and ordinance updates. Because the red here, that's kind of the tip of your spear as far as planning goes. And so this is where the rubber meets the road, essentially. Your action items coming out of these plans, and making sure the partner agency priorities are identified and how that feeds into the LUDO. And the way that these plans are connected is important because, as I mentioned, 1983 is a long time. This plan won't be updated again for a while. This one's on a 5-year cycle. CWPPs, if you're lucky, 10 to 15 years. And so our comprehensive plan is kind of the broad overlook of natural hazards. In Oregon, we have statewide planning goals. Goal number 7 is areas subject to natural hazards. So the comprehensive plan touches on, the general sense of how we're going to address each of these goals. And it specifically references, or it will reference, our NHMP, and the CWPP, to make sure that they're all tied together, so that as we update our NHMP, which we updated 4 or 5 times before we even touch our comp plan again, making sure that keeps our comp plan relatively updated as well as we update our other plans. Similar with the CWPP, and they kind of step down in their detail-oriented nature. So the natural hazard mitigation plan, of course, deals with all of our natural hazards. Here in Wasco County, we have identified 7 that are important for us: drought, severe weather, fire, flood, earthquake, landslides, and volcanoes. Other communities probably have tsunamis and hurricanes, but those are not concerns of ours in particular. Tornadoes also. And so our action items here are going to be a little bit more general. Each type of disaster will have its own kind of set of ideas of how to move forward. So for the fire ones in particular, we'll have a broad idea of increased defensible space, but down in the CWPP, our community wildfire protection plan breaks our county into 5 zones currently, and we'll see where the update takes it. But each zone, there's specific actions. Defensible space at this particular location creates defensible space, and so really down to the nuts and bolts. And so making sure all those kind of tie together in their process has been important for us. Our natural hazard mitigation plan, the requirement for FEMA, you got to have at least 1 public meeting. Ours was a community open house. We called it Disasters and Donuts. We gathered a lot of good information that day. We had some disaster movies running in the background, and a couple boards up, some your sticker exercises and whatnot. And so we took some info to help us update that there. The plan itself is looking at where the natural hazards interact with your vulnerabilities in your community. So there's a risk assessment, there's vulnerability assessments. We list out our critical facilities. And we did this through a series of steering committee meetings. Well, I'll get into the steering committee in a little bit. The actual definition of mitigation, you can read that up there. Essentially, though, what's the importance of the NHMP? For us, it's establishing that comprehensive community-level strategy, coordinating efforts. We work with a lot of different. Our steering committee was about 12 to 16 folks, but we reached out to a large list of partner agencies, up into 100 or so, including citizens and various groups from around the area. So making sure we're coordinating and prioritizing. And really the big one, a lot of communities, this is why people do it, is the big carrot in the room, is retaining that eligibility to receive federal funding for mitigation projects. So in 2000, the Disaster Mitigation Act required that communities have these NHMPs in order to maintain their eligibility for these funding programs and to update it every 5 years. And so that's really kind of the big big push there. We want to make sure we're competitive in that sense. And our goals in our NHMP, we're protecting our life and property, making sure natural resource systems are protected, facilitating partnerships, enhancing our education, and enhancing our emergency services. And we do all this, these goals get kind of balanced between, here's a quick list of our steering committee, myself on the planning, and the emergency manager kind of spearheaded the effort. We had a great assistance from our state partner, the Department of Land Conservation and Development. They applied for a grant to help us and a variety of other communities with our natural hazard mitigation plans. You know, it was the first time that I had done one. And so it's great to have somebody who's been working on them before. Before they came on board, I found a handbook online, a FEMA handbook, and an Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience handbook. And I'd go to the meeting with one chapter printed out, and I'd read yesterday, and I'd go and kind of present to the rest of the group what we were doing. And we were working our way through it, but it's great to have them come on board. Our flood and NFIP coordinator helping out and risk map, special guests occasionally coming in and giving us some information. So as a group, we could really get our heads around all the issues for all of our disasters, but also, fire being important for all these groups. That was something we talked about a lot. Here's a list of our partner agencies. Won't read through it, but there was a lot of people involved. So getting down into fire in particular, in our chapter, we discussed some of the recent major events in the county. A conflagration in Oregon is it's a notice the governor puts out when fires that are going to involve threaten life or structures. So even this one, Memlose 2, happened this year. It wasn't featured on my earlier map. It was only about 200 acres or so, but it was in an area, highly densely populated area, right in that WUI kind of scene. And so they got a conflagration, which allowed other agencies from around the state to help out. And of course, you have the FEMA fire management assistance declarations, and we had 2 of those this year out of I believe 6 total for the state. So we had a third of all FEMA FMADs. So Wasco County had a significant hit. So we wanted to make sure our NHMP was reflected, kind of why it's important, what are some of the impacts in our community, and so we're identifying some of the major trends in recent large fires. We're also identifying, this is taken from our partner agencies, the Oregon Department of Forestry, Mountain Hood. We have 2 Forest Service units. We have the Mountain Hood National Forest, and we have the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. And so they gave us their snapshot. And so earlier, mentioning how more human fires are human caused, it certainly is the case out here. 15%, well, overall, it was about 10% were lightning caused, and 90% of all of our fires were human caused. In the county, including all those major fires, we had about 200,000 acres burned this year. And so that human impact is really important to consider. So here, I mentioned earlier the action items being one of the tip of the spear. We write our natural hazard mitigation plan, we do our risk assessment, look at our vulnerabilities, we talk about how we're going to implement, make sure we have a chapter that discusses how the plan is going to be implemented and maintained in that 5-year period. But really where it comes down to it is in the action item section for us, really identifying that here on the left is a multi-hazard action items, and then our wildfire specific ones, and of course we have all the other categories as well. But you can see how these are going to be a little bit broader. They're county-wide for the wildfire ones, accomplished defensible space. That's just a general statement. And in the multi-hazard ones, a lot of these are overlapping. Education is important, having those funds on hand, et cetera, and then updating the comp plan, like I mentioned earlier, they all tie in. So identifying these in your NHMP helps keep your eligibility for funding. When our partners go out to go apply for a grant, they might either use the NHMP or the CWPP to help bolster their applications, even if it's not a federal one, just in general, pointing out this is an action item that has been identified by the county in a series of coordinated meetings to pick out, this is important to us. And so that being represented as one of the important features in your county can help get that addressed. So it's really important to identify that by partnering with various different agencies and making sure you get that citizen input so that when these are written, you have your priorities lined out. So we take that from there, we move over to a community wildfire protection plan. So I haven't dug into this one yet as far as updating it, but the current layout for our community wildfire protection plan, like I said, is broken into these 5 different sections. It describes kind of the planning process, gives the profile, and then it again also talks about wildfire-specific risk assessment, mitigation strategies, and continuing actions. The planning process, I won't read this to you, but it's important to kind of lay out how that's going to take place so that you can all work together and get it accomplished. I'm hoping we'll kick this off in January. We'll talk to all the fire districts. Or really, the last couple of times I've run into the various fire chiefs, they keep asking me when we're going to be starting it up again because they're eager to write grants with new information. We've had the CPAW team came in and gave us a great packet of recommendations and a wildfire hazard assessment, a really thorough, tailored map of our county, which really highlights some of the risk areas. And we'll be able to take that information and update this 13-year-old plan with a lot more up-to-date science and up-to-date information to make it more relevant to our community. So here's an example of some specific actions. So let's see, they're calling out specifically cleaning up these bark piles. This is a location, the lumber yard. Molly mentioned that a minute ago about how some of those industrial sites are dangerous, and so here we have a specific action item to clean that up. So when we update, we'll take a look at that, see how they did, see if it still needs to be done or if it's been accomplished, and we can take it off the list and move on to the next major issue that Zone 4 would have. And so identifying what the priority is, kind of that time frame, and who is responsible. And so the responsibility is going to be important, of course, to make sure we can follow up. If we're not updating the plan for another 10 years, we want to be able to, we still want to be able to use it. Hopefully we won't just put it back on the shelf and let it sit there for 10 years. But we'll be able to say, hey, Moppin, maybe have regular meetings. Like for the NHMP, the requirement is at least 2 annual meetings. So we'll have hopefully something similar with the CWPP, where we all get together, we talk about where we are with our action items we identified, we maybe bring a little more information in, highlight some funding sources, and we start hitting the plans. Okay, this one's the #1 priority, we're going to get to that, accomplish it by 2020, et cetera. So this helps us kind of give us a framework to continue those discussions. So that brings me to our experience with Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, program that Molly's a part of. They were excellent this year. Like I said, they came out twice so far, then they're coming out again next week to give their final presentation. Here on the left is it was their draft recommendations. They've tweaked it since to give us the final one. But it's really useful here, recommendation 3, update our community wildfire protection plan. Of course, we're already planning on that, but they give us some language on why it matters and some implementation guidance if we're ever dealing with maybe pushback about a certain thing from either political or different agencies. We have kind of this in our back pocket from a very solid organization, a well-researched data. So it won't be just us planners saying, hey, we need to do this. It'll be, this is why we need to do this and why it's important. And here's just an example of one of their tools. I took this off their website. That lays out some of the different ways, different types of tools you could use. And so we here in Wasco County want to tailor it to what our needs are, what we have that's strong, and where our weaknesses are. And so they help to identify that. Some of the other tools they provided us, here's an image of kind of, when we're giving those presentations, we're talking about updating our ordinance, and we want to put more requirements in for fire safety. If we're getting pushback from home builders or pushback from political bodies, we want to be able to demonstrate, how this is important and with the latest science. So, our current defensible space just lists You know, a generic 50 feet doesn't really talk anything about neighboring fuels or overlapping home ignition zones. That's kind of a more recent discussion. So this is a good graphic to help us in our discussions moving forward. Another one you guys saw earlier kind of shows that continuum and how we might maybe take it from community-wide. Since our current fire safety standards are for the entire community, we might be able to tailor it for each of our type of zone. Like maybe we'll remap it out to a wildlands, rural, suburban area. But really, there's nowhere in our community or county that doesn't burn. Even our county seat here in the Dalles, we have fires inside the city limits, inside the urban growth boundary regularly that push up in the backyards of folks. So this is important everywhere. And the city of the Dalles Public Works Director was on our Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan Steering Committee, and they have their own NHMP as well. But it's important to kind of work together in that sense. And this will be interesting. In a minute, I have another slide that shows our current picture. You know, the house, as planners, we have a little bit less influence over what a building is made of. The building code has a preemption, but we can provide recommendations or provide information, education to our homeowners and contractors. So they kind of give us another image to show some of the different ways that you can address that. We currently address it, but not quite to the same level. I thought this one was interesting. I talked earlier about slope and just the difference between, you might have defensible space that reaches out to 50 feet, but it's more important to have a 60-foot downslope, and maybe you can have a slightly shorter one upslope. And so kind of having those different buffers, different zones could be something to consider. So that's kind of what we are looking at updating in the future, and we'll take those recommendations forward. What we currently have is our Wasco County Fire Safety Standards, and we hit on 5 major categories: siting standards, defensible space, construction standards, access, and then our fire protection requirements. For siting standards, that's where we're really making sure that our structures are pushed back from the slope. 30, those 30% slopes is kind of that key number. I think our standards might actually say 40% right now, and so it's more important to get it down to 30. Especially things that overhang. You don't want decks or eaves above there. They kind of collect that heat, collect that ember storm. So I didn't mention earlier, as far as how fire spreads, is you'll have a lot of people think a wall of flame runs through town and burns everything in its path. That's really not the way it works. Molly mentioned the ember shower, and a fire will have a big kind of center area, and the wind will push all the embers ahead of it, and then the embers, if it's grassland or forest, it'll start little spot fires. The spot fires will grow, and they'll pull the fire, and it'll sort of leapfrog its way forward. It doesn't move as kind of a wall. It sort of like spots itself out in front. And part of that spotting process could be your home. It throws these showers of embers onto your home. Even from last year, Eagle Creek Fire jumped the Columbia River. I mean, there's a spot fire from that about half a mile away. And so these big burning embers can really go a long distance. Even little ones can be dangerous for your house. They can get up into your soffits, your gaps in your eaves, land in gutters that aren't cleaned out, and that's where the homes burn. So you could see the actual fire front, the blackened forest, is a quarter mile away, and then here's a community that wasn't even close to that, that has a half a dozen homes all burned up. And so that's really important to make sure that all those kind of fire risk areas are burned up in your house. And if you're defensible space, that's kind of where you clear a zone around your house. And it doesn't necessarily mean a clear cut. We're not talking clear every piece of vegetation within 50 feet. For ours, it's make sure your grass is 4 inches, no taller than 4 inches. All trees are limbed up 8 feet. There's breaks in the canopy, and there might be requirements in the future that we have this 5-foot no vegetation zone, because that's really where the major stuff is. Don't leave your firewood stacked up underneath your deck. That's going to collect some embers, and there's your combustibility right there. So ensuring that our defensible space and our construction standards, and like I said before, that's where building codes really plays a role, but we can make recommendations. And access is important. You saw that one way in, one way out subdivision proposed that Molly showed. For us in the county, we have a lot of long driveways. As a firefighter, you come up on a driveway and you have to make a decision whether to drive down it or not. And if it's overgrown and narrow and tight and different slopes and you don't know who's coming out, you might not even drive down that road to look at what's at the end of it, just for your firefighter safety. So we want to make sure that the firefighters can access the home, that there's turnouts available every couple hundred feet. So if there are residents evacuating, firefighters, somebody can pull over into a turnout and let somebody by. And then at the end, making sure there's, fire trucks are large, they need to be able to turn around. So in the rural areas, we want to make sure that they can come to the end of this driveway and not have to back their way out. If that's the case, they're not going to stick around. And so the access is important to ensure that the firefighters can get in and out safely. And then, our last standard there is whether there's kind of, we don't have fire districts in every, it's not universal. There are places in our county where you call for fire and you're not a taxing district, and that's something we're trying to change. It's not, in Oregon has a state law requiring universal coverage for ambulance, but it's not quite there for fire. So there's big gaps around the state that don't have that response. And then, of course, when the fire does happen, there's all kinds of considerations to take into account. But if you're not in a fire district, we are going to require that you have on-site water. So when a fire truck does come, they're coming from far away. They'll have access to something to be able to help protect your house. And then we'll ask for a fire safety mitigation plan that kind of details, okay, well, if you can't meet these standards, how can you do a couple extra things, maybe put some sprinklers in, and then get our fire districts to approve that. So we really try to involve our local fire districts in making sure that new construction is fire safe. And here's a picture of what we currently have, identifying some features that you might want to consider making sure you have covered in your house to decrease your fire risk. And so this will be updated with the more modern science, specific standards for screens. Maybe it's 1/8 of an inch instead of 1/4 inch. So a couple of final slides here, just wrapping up a couple of details I mentioned earlier. I want to go into a little more depth about. I talked about unprotected lands. Well, this kind of lays out, this was 2011, and actually it's done a great job since then. But here in Wasco County, we have the Forest Service, ODF, various fire districts are covering and the reservation are covering the western side of our state real well. But you get up into those agricultural lands, get into that eastern rangeland, and they're just big red spots on the map. And you can see across the state, there's a huge swath of that as well. The yellow is a rangeland fire protection district, which is slightly different than a fire district in there. And we're actually today approving a new rangeland fire protection district in eastern Wasco County, and there's another one on consideration just north of that. So we're starting to clear up some of these red spaces so that we have that in place, and so that there's more coordinated response, that those standards are up there. Because currently, the ranchers do a great job of fighting fire. They'll go out there with a ranch truck, they know how to put it out, they work together, but they don't, if another agent, these big fires, substation fire, you can't communicate with them. You don't have the same radios, you don't have the same training, they don't have the same requirements, so they might not know that a fire is changing direction, et cetera, and then they're at risk. And so that's a great example of that this year was the one life that we lost on the substation fire. And so wanting to make sure these fire districts are established so that we have that interconnectivity between our districts. And so promoting that in your county or area is vital in the West. And the last piece of information here, I mentioned building codes a couple of times. Currently, they don't do a whole lot in Oregon. They have a roofing requirement, which is important. A fire-resistant roof is one of the best ways to protect your house, but they are approving Appendix W, which unfortunately is optional, but at least it's a start. They tried to do this a couple of years ago, and the Home Builders Association put a big fight back, pushed back hard. There were some quotes, it's going to cost $12,000 extra per house, and so all this, affordable housing is a big deal, and so we don't want to add all this onerous regulation. But actually, a report was just released that lays out the actual cost, did the research, looked at 4 major areas and pointed out, okay, it's actually a negligible difference, in some cases less, to be more fire safe. Having that cement siding versus cedar is going to be major increase in protection and actually a little bit cheaper and easier to maintain, et cetera. So Appendix W coming out next year. So this is where the fight's going to happen. The counties are going to have to each onboard this locally. So there'll be some pushback there, but hopefully we'll be able to have enough information from our recent work with CPAW and some other groups and the studies that we've been looking at to be able to show, hey, this is great for our county, great for our community, and we really need to decrease that at risk to wildfire. Here's a couple of resources for you. So when these slides come out, you'll be able to access those. Don't feel like you have to write down all those websites right now. These plan update materials were really useful for me before I started working with DLCD as far as understanding what it is we had to do step by step to update our NHMP. And finally, here's our contact info. So that's all I have for you. I believe we'll leave this slide up, and Christine, we're ready to take some questions.
Wonderful. Okay, we have just a few minutes, so I'm just kind of cherry picking a couple here. If your question doesn't get answered, just feel free to reach out to our speakers. First question, in preparation of climate change impacts such as heat islands within urban places, we are promoting vegetation. This seems to be in conflict with fire prevention measures. What do you recommend?
Yeah, I'll just speak to that real quickly. One of the major influences on the substation fire going so big this year is CRP practices. So it's a conservation resource program, I think. It's a federal, might be part of the 2014 Farm Bill. And they're looking at updating it this year. But in any case, it's a new way to farm. Kind of they started doing no-till farming, leaving kind of lands, let them grow a little bit. It helps with soil, it helps water, but it created a continuous bed of fuel. And so, you know, it is dynamic because you have to look at the benefits that you get from something like that. Protect that vegetation is going to be important to maintain that water supply, and climate change is going to have effect on water supply. But in a drought hits and a fire starts, it all burns away. And so I think it's going to be an important balancing act to create that vegetative cover in a sensible way, but also maintain some sort of fire breaks, because previously, you know, they'd have these tilled fields and the fire would just stop. That was not the case this year.
I'll just tack on to that too, that it's a great question. And there are a couple things to think about. One would be the type of vegetation that you're putting in place. So often, this is not a rule, but often deciduous trees will be more fire resistant. And it goes back to that plant list idea that I shared, is, you know, working with your local forester or cooperative extension service to identify what kind of vegetation would be most appropriate, and also where to locate that vegetation. So you aren't necessarily, if you're increasing vegetation within an urban area, you still want to maintain some distances between structures. And then on the structural side, you know, looking at what ways you might want to change some of the structural features so that they are more ignition resistant. So both on the landscaping side and the structural side, there's definitely ways to accommodate, you know, both, and increasing the vegetation for climate change emissions reductions, but also making sure you're not increasing, you know, your vulnerability to wildfires.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are there good guidelines for above ground cisterns for water storage? Are there examples of fireproofing standards for residential development, such as concrete siding, etc.?
Yes, the short answer is yes. There are, and I mentioned this just briefly, but there's going to be a lot more detail in the PAS report. The International Code Council has a Wildland-urban interface model code. It's available online for free to view, so you do have to purchase it, I think, if you want to download it, but anyone can actually view it. So we refer to it as the WUI code. It's the International Code Council Wildland-urban interface code, as well as the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, also has standards for water supply and storage. And those are all fine. Again, both of these will be in the PAS report for reference, but you can Google NFPA technical standards or ICC WUI code. And also, this is, again, the opportunity to approach, you know, if you have a local fire marshal or a fire chief that you can communicate with, they'll be very familiar with how to access these kind of standards.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Any suggestions for addressing mitigation in rural subdivisions in the WUI that have been in place for decades, or for maintaining the vegetation management on an ongoing basis? Any ideas to encourage property owners to do mitigation individually and on a larger community basis in their area?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. You know, when somebody comes to apply for a new house, we give them the chapter, we check off all these boxes on their fire safety self-certification checklist and say, yes, I'm going to do these things. And we put a condition of approval in their application that they will maintain it, and that is recorded in the deeds. However, we don't have a follow-up, you know, a small county, small budget, possibly, that doesn't enable us to go out and check these regularly. We rely on our partners, the fire districts, to help maintain those in their areas. There are some programs at the state level that we can have, that some homeowners apply to through ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry. But as far as ensuring that they're ongoing, you know, we have kind of that one thing that says, yes, you said you're going to do it, and so hopefully you will, but no way to follow up. There are some good examples of some programs. I'm going to call out Project Wildfire, Deschutes County. They are a grant-funded program. Allison Green, I believe, is the one who runs that program, and she gave a presentation at a recent conference where they talked about, she has a 27-member steering committee. They have 9, I think, CWPPs that they keep updated throughout the county in their various communities. But they also receive grants to go out and help people accomplish that defensible space, and really help prioritize where to hit. And so do a little research into what they're doing, and Bend in general is kind of on the forefront of, when they approve a subdivision, doing some really good regulations to ensure that they're built and there's some kind of tool in there to maintain that, either through a homeowners association requirement or some kind of fund set up at the outset. So there's a couple of examples down there in Central Oregon to look for.
I would just quickly tack on too that there's some really great national resources that are also for free. The National Fire Protection Association's FireWise program has some really good downloadable education and outreach resources, which highlight, particularly for homeowners, what they can do on their properties to maintain defensible space. And they encourage homeowners to work together in neighborhoods that are these existing neighborhoods. Other states will have a lot of good resources, so contact your state forestry department or look online, and the chances are very high that they will have some really good free materials that you can use to supplement. You know, we always advocate for any regulations you put in place have to be supplemented by education and outreach. So there's a lot of good existing material out there that target homeowners and property owners for maintenance.
Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close us up. So thanks to Will and Molly and Christine for joining us today. Much appreciated. And I'm so glad that we were able to finally get this done. And we did it without any flaws. And so thank you. And this was a great topic and very timely. Again, everyone, just as a reminder that we'll have this recorded up on our YouTube page, and we'll have a PDF copy of it on our webcast webpage. Just visit ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, everyone, thanks. And this was it for 2018. So we'll see everyone in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.